conservation, communication, and education. And today's guest had to travel. Well, I mean, we're virtual, but the distance between us is a little bit greater. A lot of times when we're talking to folks who work in state government, they're like across the street from the museum here in downtown Raleigh. But today we're actually headed out to the coast. Tancred Miller is the Policy and Planning Section Chief for the Division of Coastal Management within the Department of Environmental Quality. And Tancred joins me now. Hey, welcome.
Good morning, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Glad you could be here. I'm excited to hear about what's going on out a few hours east of us from here in Raleigh.
All right. Well, I'm happy to share, and there's certainly a lot going on. As we know, these are interesting times on a number of fronts, and from our division, we've certainly been involved in a lot of big challenges on the environmental side. So I'm here to share today with you some of the work that we've been doing to help our coastal communities who are really on the front lines of some of these big environmental challenges, some of these hazards that come from climate change, big storms, sea level rise, huge erosion events, big flooding events. And we've been trying to do our best to help those communities build their own capacity to respond to those types of events, and then take steps to build their long-term resilience so they can be more able to withstand and recover quickly when these things occur. So I will go into a short description to tell you why we got involved in this in the first place. So our division, we've been around since the mid-1970s. We came about in response to the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act, which was passed in 1972. North Carolina was one of the first states that jumped on to create a coastal program. And the program itself was designed to sort of bring some order to coastal development, so to regulate the way that the environment was protected when folks built or dredged or did any type of development activity on the coast. And so we issue permits for development. We work with our Coastal Resources Commission to develop standards for how to keep folks from being too impactful to the environment, as well as to protect their own investments as they develop on the coast. So we have a number of rules and standards, and we apply those when we issue permits. One of the things that we noticed when I came on board with the division was that the approach was fairly similar to a more inland approach to development regulation, which meaning sort of a static mindset where land boundaries don't change and hazards come and go. If there's flooding, it sort of goes away. Things are different on the coast. Land boundaries change, property boundaries change, and increasingly in this geologic time frame that we're in, flooding is not a static thing. It doesn't just come and go as we are used to in other areas. More and more, we're seeing that when this flooding comes with sea level rise, it doesn't go away as quickly. Or when it comes, it's more intense, it's more severe, it's more disruptive, and ultimately it's more impactful to the coastal communities. It costs time, it costs money, it costs people well-being, and so we set about on a task to try to sort of improve the situation on the coast and to help not just the coastal communities, but also help the environment to be more resilient to these stresses. I will go into a little bit of a PowerPoint. I'll share my screen here. And then sort of lay out for you the path that we took over the last, I'd say about 14, 15 years. So that we started with the belief that you should look at the science. And so start with what the science is saying on any issue that we regulate, especially with something like with climate, which was not well understood at that time within the state government. We knew that there were challenges, but we didn't have really good data or really good information upon which to base action. So we want to start with just what's the science for sea level rise in the North Carolina area. We used our Coastal Resources Commission Science Panel, which is a volunteer group of coastal geologists and coastal engineers. We asked them to prepare for us an assessment of sea level rise or sea level change for the state of North Carolina. We'd seen things from the IPCC at the international level. We'd seen things from the National Climate Assessment. At the national level, we'd seen regional level reports for the Southeast, but we didn't have good information for North Carolina. We had a number of tide gauges, still have a number of tide gauges on our coast that have been giving us long-term data, so decades up to a century or so of sea level data for the coast. And so we had some trends. We also had some research papers that had been written and published, giving us some look both backwards and forwards. But we wanted to put that into a form that could be digested and used by our commission, by other state agencies, by local governments, and other academics, other interested parties, so we can base any additional action or guidance upon the best available science. Following that 2010 report, one of the recommendations was that we look at doing this every 5 years. And so we came back in 2015, we produced a second report. This one was limited. The first one looked out to 200 years. There were some issues raised with that first report in 2010. So we did a second report in 2015. It looked out to 2030, and it gave sort of projections, ranges of sea level rise projections out through 2045 for different areas of the coast. And it broke it up into the regions that are tied to those tide gauges. We took that information and we started putting it out to local governments. I think last week, so very, very recent news, last week, the new report would have been due in 2020. We sort of put that one on hold because there were some things happening. The IPCC was getting ready to release a new report, which they released last year. There was some other resources coming out. So we asked Science Panel to sort of hold off a little bit and wait to see if there was a need to continue doing these 5-year updates. Just yesterday, there was a new report released for the continental US. And this is from a number of federal agencies, and you see all the organizations down below. So they put out this report, technical report yesterday, looking at projections primarily through 2050, but then also through 2100 and 2150. And some of the key messages you see here, for the continental US on average, they're projecting, roughly 9 to 11 inches of sea level rise over the next 30 years, 28 years. They're predicting a lot more high tide flooding events, sort of these sunny day flooding events that you may have heard by different names. And then they also said by 2100, there's a lot less confidence in the projected range. You see it's a pretty broad range out through 2100, and there's a number of reasons for that in the report. That's just sort of an aside. So the Science Panel now is sort of on a different track. So they'll be looking at this type of information and coming back, instead of producing a new assessment, they'll just sort of summarize these things and give the highlights and just let the commission know what are the implications for North Carolina. So starting with science, we said, let's pivot to work with communities directly. Let's look at speaking with them one-on-one. Let's find out what their needs are, where their hazards are, where their challenges are, and how can we best assist in getting them information, getting them resources, understanding where they're coming from and what their challenges are, so that we can take those lessons out to other communities and sort of build a wider community of resilience practice. So we picked these 5 back in 2016, and we worked with them individually. We worked with their local governments, we worked with their residents. We went out on site, we looked at where their flooding challenges were, or their other challenges were on the coastal hazard side. We engaged their communities, we mapped their critical assets. We looked at where were your vulnerable populations, where were your most critical wetlands, or your other types of whether it be physical assets or natural assets or human assets, where were those things located and where did those things intersect with the biggest hazards? And then how could we as a community identify strategies to mitigate some of those challenges? We built for them a couple of resources. One was this website, which is sort of just a compendium of a number of different types of resources that they can use on their own to bootstrap themselves into a better resilience position. So it includes things like, hazards forecasts and the data, adaptation examples from other parts of the country or other parts of the world, some policy ideas. What can you do at the local level with ordinances, et cetera, to make yourselves stronger? What sort of tools are there at your disposal to understand and communicate with your communities? And then where can you find funding to implement some of these ideas that you're coming up with? We took those 5 community examples, those 5 pilot communities. We built then a story map that sort of laid out in detail what the process was, how the mapping was done, how the engagement was done. And we put that up as an example for other communities to look at. We also built this story map that is I guess we call it sort of a resilience guide or a roadmap for communities to engage on their own, finding these resources and understanding how to use all those tools. So if you want to do a sort of a rational stepwise process to build resilience, where do you start? What sorts of starting points are there? And if you've already done some of these steps, like you've already done some vulnerability assessment or you've already engaged your communities, then what's left? What are the other main pieces that you need to do to get to where you want to go? And so we lay this out stepwise process and put that out to communities through a couple of venues. In 2019, we did a couple of workshops, one up in the northern part of the coast, one in the southern part of the coast. And we targeted local government staff. We felt like this was probably the best avenue to get folks to uptake that information and be able to start to implement. And so we reached out to folks from all over the coast and even beyond the coastal zone that were interested. And we held these events where we walked through some of the science and then we walked through some of the engagement steps and some of the resilience building ideas. 2 very good workshops. We have a report that's on our website that laid that out, and then we tied that all together with the Resilience Summit that we held in July, I believe, of that year, June of 2019, in Havelock, where we sort of brought together then a wider community of practice. So we had more scientists, social scientists that could speak to challenges on the human side. We had natural scientists that could speak to challenges on the environmental side. We had policy folks, we had legal folks, we had local government folks sharing lessons learned, et cetera. So really started to build a good, broad community of understanding and practice on the coast for resilience. Right around the same time as we were planning those events, we had the Governor's Executive Order 80. That executive order sort of built upon some of the things we were doing, like building this resilience community of practice. But it also took a couple of ideas that we had used. So for one example is starting with the science. So for us, we did the sea level rise assessment reports. In this case, for the executive order, we produced this climate science report, which is the first of its kind for North Carolina, and it's on DEQ's website. I encourage you to take a look at it. This was done on a volunteer basis from some good folks up in Asheville. They're all listed in the report. I encourage you to look that up on our website and dig into it. They basically took the National Climate Assessment, took the Southeast chapter of that assessment, and then downscaled it to North Carolina. So it's very specific to our state, and it's the first time we've ever done this for North Carolina. Hopefully we'll continue to produce this report on a regular basis so that information is always current. The next big piece that came out of that executive order for us was this climate risk assessment and resilience plan. This is an inward-looking plan for North Carolina's cabinet agencies. So all of the departments that report to the governor were involved in writing this plan. And so it's looking for us internally, what are our challenges, our vulnerabilities that come from climate that, can impact our ability to provide services, to implement our mission on behalf of the citizens of North Carolina. And then what sorts of steps should we be taking internally over the short and long term to address those challenges? One of the, there are a number of initiatives that came out of that report. One I want to point to was the establishment of this Resilient Communities Program. This was sort of building on the idea that we had started with DCM of working directly with communities to help them build their own capacity, to help them take steps at the local level to build their ability to adapt to these hazards and changes. So the three main parts of that is that capacity building is for us to provide that technical assistance through the state, and then to supply funds where that's possible to help with the implementation of these programs. Out of that, we launched the Resilient Coastal Communities Program. So this was a subset of that EO80 strategy. So our program is focused on the 20 coastal counties in the state. NCORE, the Office of Recovery and Resiliency within the Department of Environmental Safety, they have a bigger responsibility. So they're statewide. So they have a sister program that's called RISE, and that's statewide. It covers all 100 counties in the state. We partner very closely with NCORE. We are always in communication. We're making sure that these programs are well synced, and that there's no duplication or waste of resources. So the programs are complementary, and NCORE is working with currently counties east of I-95, and they will then transition to the counties west of I-95. Our other key partners on this program are North Carolina Sea Grant. They are extension agents. They work coastwide, and they have great resources, and they're in communities, and they're well-known, well-respected. So they're a great partner for us. And then also the Nature Conservancy, who's been a wonderful partner, getting us more up to speed on things like natural nature-based solutions to climate challenges, helping us on funding side, and as well as program implementation. So it's a very good group that we have. We meet frequently, and we interact really well. So a lot of the success for this program is due to the partnerships that we built with these organizations. We created some sort of overarching objectives for the program. Obviously, one is to address these barriers. There's lots of barriers to resilience. There's political barriers, there's financial barriers, there's human resource barriers, there's knowledge gaps, there's lots of things, lots of challenges that folks have. And so one of our biggest goals at the outset was to have, to lower that bar to participate, to make it as easy as possible for folks to engage, to understand, to begin to engage with their communities and build an understanding, and be able to really think about these long-term challenges, not just immediate emergencies. We wanted to help communities really understand their risk and vulnerabilities, especially for these critical assets. And these are both their physical assets and their natural assets, and their people in the communities. We wanted to address what we saw as a huge gap in the system of funding resilience from the national level. There's a lot of different funding streams or funding opportunities for resilience projects, but what they typically ask for is that you come with a shovel-ready project, something that's been vetted, it's been permitted, it's just ready to go. And we just didn't have a lot of those in North Carolina. That was a huge gap. And so we hadn't been able to really compete well for those parts of funding. So one thing that this program was intended to do was to help build that portfolio of these prioritized and vetted projects that we can then compete, be on a, sort of level the playing field with the other states and other communities across the country that are competing for these same funds. And then, not just those national, but there's also funding streams at the state level. So we wanted to build, this sort of a well thought out and vetted and community engaged process for the long-term resilience building. So also we want to build capacity. We want to make sure that, it's not just we walk in, we do a planning exercise, we hand you a check, and then we walk away. We want to make sure that when we left, but when we complete the program, that we leave these communities with increased capacity, so that they now have the ability to take the next steps, to continue the process, to find additional funding, to identify additional projects, and go through and sort of replicate and be able to continue to do this work and improve their situations. We wanted this to be an incentive-based a program. We didn't want it to be mandated. We didn't want it to be a top-down, thou shalt, thou must. We want it to be, we're offering a service, some assistance. If you're interested, we're happy to provide, but this is going to be something that you have to decide on your own is worthwhile for you and your community. We wanted to focus a lot on vulnerable populations, those that are traditionally underserved, those often are minority populations, immigrant populations, elderly populations, so folks that tend to be sort of sidelined, whether by design or just by oversight. We wanted to put a spotlight on those folks and make sure that they are being brought into the program. That's been harder, to be honest, with COVID. It's harder to get into communities and do that work. But we are trying to make every effort we can to ensure that we're getting to those populations. And then we want to meet communities where they are. We didn't want to make this a one size fits all. This is, it's built so it's sort of you can jump in if you had already completed some of the steps. You can jump in and move to the next step. We got some funding. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. We got some funding to bring in, for the first round of this program, 26 communities. So we have 8 counties and 18 municipalities that are now going through this Resilient Coastal Communities program. And they're listed here. You can see there's a wide range, a lot of diversity in geographic, as well as economics, population size, etc. So we also brought in, since we don't have the internal staff capacity to provide this technical assistance to all these communities, we went out to the private sector, to academia, to councils, government, and said, we need your help. We want to be basically partners with you in doing this coast-wide experiment of building this resilience capacity across the coast. And so we put out a request for applications, and we got probably 30 or so applications from different contractors. We selected 10, and then we paired these 10 contractors with the 26 communities so that they could then provide the technical assistance. Now, here's a map that shows sort of the geographic distribution of those communities, and it shows the companies or the organizations that are matched to provide that service. So this work is well underway. We started, I think, about July or August of last year, and we're getting ready to wrap up this first stage of getting through the vulnerability assessments, community engagement, and as well as some project identification and prioritization. We built this program into 4 phases. So the first phase you'll see there is that vulnerability assessment and community engagement phase. The second phase, which we're running sort of concurrently through a single application process, is this planning and then project selection and then prioritization of those projects. So out of this phase 1, phase 2, each community will have a sort of a portfolio of the highest priority projects, maybe about 5 or so of priority projects, as well as their vulnerability assessment for the critical assets and the populations. And they will have done some significant community engagement to get to this step. Once that's complete, that'll be complete in the next probably couple of months, we'll move these communities into phase 3, which is engineering and design for one of their top priority projects. That's to get them to that shovel-ready point where they can then compete for those national funding streams or state funding streams to get the implementation funding. We do have a little bit of money in our program for implementation or construction, but that's not our focus within our division. We think our focus is probably better placed on the initial first 3 phases, getting communities to the point where they've done the planning, the assessment, the engagement, the engineering, and then they're ready to go out and get those implementation dollars. We built a planning handbook or design planning handbook to make sure that this technical assistance is as consistent as possible. Since we have multiple contractors working with multiple communities, and they're all coming from different backgrounds, different experience, we want to make sure that we were standardizing as much as possible the steps that each community would go through and the assistance that would be provided to make sure that all the communities were being serviced as consistently as possible. We're learning some lessons from this, of course. Nothing is perfect, and we'll make some improvements. One of them being we will probably require some training for our contractors. We didn't do that this first round, but I think one of the things we've learned is that even with this handbook, there is some inconsistency. And so maybe it does make sense to do what other states have done, which is make sure that your service providers have been through some type of a training process or training or workshop to make sure that they're doing this as consistently as possible. Each of these steps, each of these phases, phase 1, 2, 3, and 4 has a number of steps. And you can see, for example, phase 1, here are the steps that are listed. And so these are all included in that handbook. It's all laid out. And then each one includes a description of what does it mean to form a community action team, who are those key stakeholders that should be involved, how do you develop a vision, what existing plans should you look to, etc. And then when you're doing the mapping of your critical assets, who should be involved in that process, how should that be presented, where do you get the resources to do a good job on a risk and vulnerability assessment, including those vulnerable populations, looking at the financial costs of different types of disaster scenarios, etc. Here's step 2. We have a few steps involved in step 2. And these lead to that project portfolio. When you put all those pieces together, all those steps, all those deliverables, you end up with what we're calling a resilience strategy. So that's sort of your roadmap for how you want to get through taking those prioritized projects and getting those to construction. These are the main pieces that will be included in that. So each of these 26 communities, at the end of this phase 1, phase 2 process, will have this resilience strategy that includes all of these steps. They'll have the GIS data that we can use to, again, run different scenarios and manipulate in different ways to make sure that we're always able to capture the most current information. For phase 3 engineering design, we'll get that started later this spring, and hopefully get that done by Christmas or this time next year. Then we move into phase 4, which is construction. One thing I forgot to mention is that there is no match requirement. So we're providing these funds to local governments. Again, financial being one of those barriers, we didn't want to have a match requirement that some of these communities would not be able to meet. There's a focus in these construction projects or these portfolio projects to focus on natural and nature-based type solutions or features that would help with the resilience to these flooding and other coastal hazards. There's a number. There's dozens and dozens of resources out there, guides, websites that show you examples of how you can incorporate natural and nature-based features into your resilience building efforts. So I just threw up 3 quick ones that we tend to look to, but the communities, we've given them access to a broader list. The contractors have access to broader lists as well as their own experience. But just want to mention that there is that emphasis on designing with nature and using nature-based features. we did a quick look at, what's the need, financial need for this program based on the number of communities we have on the coast, how many we have participating now, and how many would be left to participate if they so chose. Our current funding level for the phase 1, phase 2 is $30,000 per community. So that's what we give to each of the contractors for each community, is about $30,000 to walk through all of these phase 1 and phase 2 steps. That's not a lot of money for a group of engineers or planners or designers to spend 6 months or more working with the community on the ground, doing engagement events, doing assessments, etc. So hopefully, in later rounds we can increase that, and we sort of have been learning one of those lessons as well. We're hearing from some contractors, hey, this is money's running out, and so if there's any way to get some more blood from that stone, we'd love to get some of that. Phase 3, we're hoping to be in the 45 to 50K range, which again is not a lot of money when you're talking to an engineering firm about designing a project that's going to be ready for permitting. Depending on the size and scale of that project, it could be well into the 6-figure range. So 50K is not going to buy us everything, but it's going to get us a start. And so once we have a proof of concept, we can then take that to hopefully beef up those numbers a little bit more. For the implementation side, we only have currently about $250,000 to $300,000 earmarked for construction. And if you're familiar with coastal construction, that's not going to buy you a whole lot either. That's really meant to be a sort of demonstration scale proof of concept again for this program. But again, that's not going to be our focus. So we're not going to focus too much on building the war chest for construction. We want to focus more on the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 parts of the program. This is just a snapshot of where we have the communities we have on the coast. We have about 98 municipalities and 20 counties. We've got 26 running now. So do the math, you can see what's left as far as communities. We have a long way to go to get everyone through the first rounds of this program. A few numbers quickly. This is usually an point of interest for folks, is to see what the numbers are. One of the things that we're most proud of is these community action teams, and these are key stakeholders in each community, and there could be 5 to 10 to 12 members on each of these action teams. And these folks are digging in, they're doing a deep dive on coastal resilience, long-term planning for resilience. That's over 200 people that we have on the ground doing that in-depth thinking and work on coastal resilience right off the bat. And those folks all have families, they all have friends, they all have neighbors, and they talk to those folks, and that's already paying dividends. So we're seeing a lot more conversation, we're seeing a lot more understanding of the types of challenges. Folks are connecting dots, and folks are demanding action, and they're making good constructive recommendations for things that can happen on the local level. And that's really where this is most impactful, is having that local buy-in, that local demand for finding solutions to some of these challenges. On the funding side, we've gotten 2 pots of money from the State General Assembly. In this last budget round, we got a $1.15 million. We got 3 full-time positions. One of them is permanent, thankfully, and then 2 of them are time limited. So we're in the process of filling those positions, which is a critical need for us because we also have some capacity issues to keep this program up and running. We've gotten from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation 2 pots of funding, 2 grants. One is we've been using. The other one is incoming. It's not here yet. We have another pot from HUD, which is coming through NCORE. That's another $500,000. So we've sort of cobbled together a number of different grants, different awards. The NIFWIF stuff is competitive. We have to apply. We have to write those grant applications and compete for those funds with other coastal states. The General Assembly funding obviously is not, it's not competitive. That's written into the budget. And then at the bottom there, you can see what we've used so far per community, what we've used so far total for phase 1, phase 2, the anticipated 1.2 million for phase 3, and then the 300 or so for phase 4. One thing one of the lessons we learned is that if we're giving out funding, giving out grants to local governments or to contractors, to whomever, it'd probably be a useful thing to have for our own internal purposes, consistency in the way we review those applications and consistency in the way that we hand out those grants, those funds. So we developed, along with some partners like the Coastal Federation, Nature Conservancy again, other state agencies, we developed this sort of principles and guidelines document for funding coastal resiliency projects. And so we just completed this a couple of weeks ago. But it lays out, you know, when you're giving money, how should you prioritize where those funds go? You know, we don't want to be doing this, you know, sort of just randomly or ad hoc. We want to make sure that we're as thoughtful as possible in the way that we are thinking about how folks prepare an application, submit that to us, then how we award those funds, make sure those are really focused on long-term resilience that uses nature as a big feature and you know, first does no harm. So this document it's on DCM's letterhead, but it's available. It's probably, you know, hopefully would be of use for other agencies that do give out grants or funds or loans. Anyone who's interested is welcome to get in touch with me, and I'm happy to share this document with you. Just a quick shot of our timeline next steps. Phase 1, phase 2, we're getting ready to wrap that up. Phase 3 will be starting right on the heels of that. We should have another second round of phase 1, phase 2 this summer. And then phase 4, that construction would start late this year. So that is it for my formal remarks. I will stop there. I'll stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Tancred, thank you very much. This was informative, great stuff that I didn't know was going on. Like, this is a really impressive, robust program for building in ways for communities, I think, to take advantage of the expertise that you and your team have, right? And then to actually get the resources they need to make it happen. So that's a pretty cool thing that we've got going on here in North Carolina. I like that.
Yeah, it took a lot of work to get this program off the ground. A lot of support from our department, a lot of support from the General Assembly, a lot of support from our partners in other departments and in the private sector. This is not something that we conceived of alone or certainly built alone. And I think that's one of the big lessons is that resilience, whether it be coastal resilience or inland, it's an all hands type of program. It really takes a lot of effort and a lot of people pulling in the same direction.
Absolutely. Viewers, I'll remind you that you can leave questions in the chat. Go ahead, type those up, post them there, and then I'll share your questions with our guest. But you know, I'm kind of curious about how the work begins with. I mean, like, you've outlined the phases, but how the work begins with sort of boots on the ground and talking to people in communities, and how DCM gets to know what the specific needs are, because I imagine it's different between a place like Topsail Beach and Duck, you know, even different parts of our own coast, or, you know, if it's Edenton, that's more in on the estuary versus being out on the dunes, for example. So how does DCM actually begin those conversations where you learn what the community needs are?
Yeah, that's a critical first piece. And so we tried to do that through our application process. So we did require, even though it's, you know, it's a no-match program, and it is, we call it somewhat competitive just because funds are limited.
Sure,
each community that wants to participate had to submit an application. And so that's sort of a reflective process. They had to look at what work they'd already done. They had to look at identifying some of those critical needs, some of those hazards, problem areas. They had to identify in that application who were the champions, who did they expect would be involved in working on this project. And then once they awarded the grant, they had to put together that community action team, which is their key stakeholder team. And those folks were the ones that we would initially meet with to start laying out, the entire scope for this project, along with the contractors that were working with them. So that was the entree to each community, was working with boots on the ground.
And then when it comes to incorporating vulnerable populations within these communities, because we know historically that minority populations or other disenfranchised communities haven't been included in, like you just described, an application process that might come through like a municipality or a county government. So then what's the process for making sure that everyone gets a voice?
Yeah, that remains a challenge. I don't think that there's been there's a single model that we can point to say that this really works. So this is the way it should be done. We sort of look to the contractors and the communities, and then our own research to figure out what are some of the best strategies for doing this to make it to improve upon where we've been. One of those obviously is going into the communities and not asking the community to come to you. So once you've identified where those populations are, you identify what sorts of things brings those people together. And it could be things like, community events, religious events, school events, etc. What types of opportunities could we identify where we could go in to where we can interact with those folks and explain what we were doing and ask for their participation. Like I said, it's been harder with COVID to do those things. And so we haven't been able to do as good as a job as we'd hoped on that aspect. But at the very minimum, we've been able to, get the communities to identify where those populations are, where they reside, where they work, where they recreate, etc. And so we can look to how do we make sure that at least they're being included in the thought process for these resilience projects.
Yeah, obviously y'all are thinking a lot about it and how to make it happen, even in what have been sort of the worst of times for trying to get people together. When you've got to do it like we're doing this, right? Putting people all in a room together hasn't been the safest option of late. Yeah. Let me grab a question for you from the chat. Bill is curious, to what extent have military installations been involved in this great program so far? If they haven't been, how might they best get involved?
So I think it's an opportunity for us to get more interaction. There's a group called SURPASS, Southeast Regional Partnership for Planning and Sustainability. I believe that's what it is. It's primarily a military DoD focused group, and they're active in North Carolina as well as other southern states. We've interacted with that group to some extent to let them know what we're doing and to see, begin to identify opportunities for overlap. Since our program is so community focused, I think there may be limited areas where there's natural overlap in our interests, but certainly the military communities, they live and work in these towns, in these counties, and so they would participate as just natural stakeholders within the process. I think we're still open to more formal partnership between the installations themselves, but those things have not yet really been identified.
Yeah, something tells me that if you're going to say do a big resiliency construction project, out, I don't like near Camp Lejeune that they would probably have something. They'd probably want
Yeah.
an ear on that. So
Well,
makes a lot of sense.
I will say though, Chris, that the military installations themselves, they're very much up to speed on resilience. They're in this environment, and they see the impacts of sea level rise and erosion and storms, and so they're taking their own steps to build their own resilience to these things. And so just through our office, we see requests for projects that they want to undertake on their own installations. And so there's not much overlap between the communities and those projects, but they're certainly taking steps on their own.
We had a program. It's been a few years now, of course, but where we had former and current military leaders within the state and government officials actually talk about some of the work that's going on in North Carolina and in Virginia, where they're seeing so many of these major changes that really cost communities and the federal government in this case a lot of time and money. And doing the work now and spending the money to build resilient communities, and especially the nature and nature-based solutions that you talked about, go a long way to just making everyone safer in the future.
Yeah, it certainly goes to military readiness, and they've made that a priority up and down the coast and all over the country. You're seeing military response.
All right, let me grab another one for you. Let's see. I know it depends on where you live, but what are two of the most pressing concerns of coastal communities?
That's a very open-ended question.
I know I'm thinking like, my goodness, how do you pick?
Yeah.
Like you've got like high tide flooding, like daytime flooding, just sea level rise in the next 50 years that could.
Yeah, it really runs. I mean, it really runs the entire spectrum, everything from drug abuse to coastal erosion to flooding. Riverine flooding is a huge one for a lot of communities, not just the storm surge, but riverine flooding is a big one. COVID continues to be a huge thing, so it really runs the whole spectrum of issues. Hard to pick just two.
What would you say? Having done the show a few times, I've got a sense that the crowd here is pretty interested in sort of the ecology of these areas and issues like how climate is going to impact communities. So if we were going to narrow it down to like ecological nature issues, is it flooding all up and down the coast? Is it coastal erosion?
I think one of our big ones is wetlands, coastal wetlands. They play such an important role in on the coast, from just the habitat value, the water quality benefits, the storm surge protection, the aesthetics. They're such a huge part of the coastal ecosystem, and yet they are literally the front line for flooding and erosion and sea level rise. So there's huge challenges that we've been working hard for the life of our program to really get a good handle on what's happening, what's the status of our coastal wetlands, how are they changing from year to year, and then what are the main threats to our coastal wetlands? Is it pollution? Is it sea level rise? Is it coastal erosion from boat wakes, those types of things? And how do we make sure that we have coastal wetlands? Do we do restoration? Do we make sure that they have pathways to migrate? Do we do what's called thin layer placement, where we add sediment to raise the elevation of those wetlands so they don't get drowned by sea level rise. When we do shoreline protection, like erosion control, bulkheads versus living shorelines, that, you know, there's a whole slew of challenges and solutions for coastal wetlands, but I think that's probably one that's on the forefront of our minds.
Katie wants to know, what do you find as community resilience and needs beyond housing and infrastructure? Physical health and mental health after repeated flooding, for example?
Mental health is a big one. You know, we saw after 2015, 2016, 2018, those hurricanes and the aftermath of those on, you know, the physical destruction was huge, but the mental health challenges, I think, were even greater, and sustained. You know, they went on for years and years as people struggled to put their homes back together, get their businesses back together, get their schools going again. The loss of income, all those things had a real big effect, and remains a challenge. And then, you know, on the heels of that, to have the COVID restrictions, you know, mental health is certainly a huge challenge. Not something that we address directly, but certainly something that we see as just as members of the community.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the hurricanes examples, I mean, that's such an important aspect, which also makes me think about the work that you're doing, building resilience on the coast, but how that work translates into the rest of North Carolina. Like resiliency and talking about it and working on everything from infrastructure to then, you know, being involved in working in communities. Like there's lessons for that. Like that helps people who live in like Fayetteville,
Yeah.
who might have to deal with flooding and other issues from major storms. But those same lessons can also help folks that are like in Asheville or Boone.
Right. Yeah, and I think that just highlights the importance of our partnership with NCORE. So Amanda Martin, who's our Chief Resilience Officer for the state of North Carolina, as well as her team and their RISE program, you know, we are sharing lessons with them in real time. So they're letting us know what's working for them or not working, and likewise, we do the same for the RCCP. And then so those lessons are able to flow back and forth seamlessly across the state. It's a really important partnership, and we're so grateful to have that opportunity to work with NCORE.
Excellent stuff. All right, let's see. There's a question here from Madison who wants to know if North Carolina names on stuff. Tyrell County?
Tyrell County.
T-Y-R-E-L, Tyrell?
Yep.
Can they be included?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, everyone on the coast can be included in the RCCP, and then everyone in the state can be included in RISE. So yeah, there's resources for every community in North Carolina.
And with the last couple of minutes we've got, can you remind folks how they can get access to reading materials, websites, resources?
Yep. So our website is nccoastalmanagement.net. You can go on there. You can find my contact information. You can find other folks in my office, Mackenzie Todd, who's our coastal resilience specialist, working with these communities every day. And then, you know, email me or Mackenzie, and we're happy to talk to anyone anytime and build partnerships and continue to grow the resilience practice in the state.
Excellent, excellent stuff. Tancred, thanks for being on the program today.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
It's really good to know that we've got smart, intuitive, and professional folks like you out there on the front lines for our state.
I appreciate that, Chris. You guys are doing a great job getting the word out to the rest of the state. So thanks for the opportunity.
Folks, thanks for tuning in to another great edition of the Lunchtime Discovery Series. I know you enjoyed it because I learned a lot and had a great time too. So don't forget, we're here just about every Wednesday at noon on the museum's YouTube channel with the Lunchtime Discovery Series. And of course, we'll be back here again next week with another great presentation. So I hope that we'll see you again soon. Make sure that you are following the Office of Environmental Education on social media. On Twitter, they're at North Carolina EE. And you can find out about more programs and events from them, including this lecture series at their website, eenorthcarolina.org. And of course, you can also get that information at the museum's website and social media. We're naturalsciences.org, and our handle is at Natural Sciences on all the social media accounts. So from all of us here at the museum and the Office of Environmental Education, thanks for being with us. We'll see you again next time. Bye, everybody.